Hey, welcome everyone to Energy OS. Today we're going to talk about something that sits at the energy transition but often stays hidden from view. The physical digital infrastructure, the connectivity that makes up our modern energy system. My guest today is Manu Rawat, a technology leader whose career spans nearly 3 decades. We spent from 2020 to 2025 addressing some of the transformation challenges across the UK smart metering network. And recently, Manu's been leaning into the European smart meter space, so I'm sure some of our listeners today are really going to appreciate some of those EU insights. We're going to explore the evolution of smart meters from device to what I think is sensors, a little bit around the role of AI in the future grid, and most importantly, what it takes today to lead technology and what the future looks like. Manu, welcome.
Thanks, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to have like a podcast with you. Always pleasure, as you know. So looking forward for it, and hope we'll have a good 1 hour of discussions around key topics which you just highlighted. So yeah, bring it on.
Thanks, Manu. It's always good to go through the journey and set the scene from a bit of that background, I guess. And I guess going back to God, a little bit like me, mine was a bit before yours, but back in 1998, you were sort of commissioning some of, I guess, India's first wireless networks.
Yeah.
That was your grounding, an engineer at heart.
Yeah.
And today you're helping steward smart metering infrastructure that touches millions of UK households. That's quite a journey, Manu.
Yeah.
I guess when you look back across that journey from a field engineer in India to where you are today at the centre of the UK's infrastructure, are there really real sort of inflection points? Not just the moves you've made across that career, but really things that have made you think differently around the role technology's got, certainly around scaling, connecting every home, and the responsibility you've got as part of that stewardship.
Yeah. A great question to start with, Mike. And I think it's good to always have, as a technologist, have a reflection of what journey as an individual and a leader you have come through. So I think yes, you're right. My journey started at I would use the technical term called the edge of the system, right? So basically, if you look at the stack levels, right, of what we all know about, I think as an RF engineer, you're right, focused on 3 key things, right, around connectivity, signal integrity, and reliability. I think that drove me into that RF space. What gave me an early appreciation was in terms of like the communication, in terms of the infrastructure, was around how mission critical communication underpins everything else we do in terms of transition of technology, right? So as I progressed, I deliberately, you can say, moved up the stack. So from the physical aspects into when you look at the OSI 7 layers, which you're already aware of, which audience who listen to this will be aware of, from individual radio links, I will say, into more of a, I would say, hardware and semiconductor space, then into software, and ultimately into devices and networks, which effectively what we are calling now is a full infrastructure, right? Full scale infrastructure. Now, why I was drawn, I think, into this space was when I look at my journey and really think was increasingly in terms of problems, resolution of national scale, and how as a technologist we can bring a societal impact. And what exactly drove me into the energy space after spending around 2 decades into IT and telecom, into DCC, which I'm currently employed with, and where I think we had really good collaboration. And I see that more around alignment with what we are doing in the energy space on smart metering, right? It's a great kind of examples of convergence of all these things together. And for me, and I've seen you discussing this quite often, devices and networks are just a kind of things. But I think if you look at building a secure infrastructure in terms of what we do in energy space, the digital backbone, it's more about how you build that as a resilient system. Because for me, the root, and which I touched earlier when I started this, was reliability and the constraints are fundamentals. And applying that to or across entire ecosystem, when you look at the infrastructure, is so fundamental. Because if I look at that space, what we do forward is how do you drive that intelligence? How do you become data-driven focus? All these things will enable a nation to move into a net zero transition. So I think it's been in a journey which I started and looked at. And what I would say, yes, it was RF focused, it was connectivity and reliability focused, but it evolved at system level to scale, which is what I think organizations like DCC and others in Europe are doing, is creating that backbone of energy system. That smart metering is one part of it, but it's not yet the final part, right? In terms of if you want to move forward for the future. So yeah, it's been in a journey which actually has improved me in my capability, skills, and leadership.
Yeah, Manu, fab. And you touched on one that we'll go on to next, which is the backbone or the digital spine.
Yeah.
You use two words there, which I think are often overlooked. And many, a lot of what we do as engineers is making sure they go overlooked, which is around connectivity and reliability. Connectivity is always unseen because it just generally works most of the time. And boy, if you come from that telco background, there's a lot of unseen work that goes in to ensure we have resilient connectivity available at all times. And that's critical when, certainly when we've got connectivity at the heart of our energy system. Always on, always available is going to be absolutely critical because it's going to be enabling devices to orchestrate in the future.
Exactly, and we'll touch base in future. I think, as you said, as you transition to real time, that's fundamental. If you don't have that built as a basic, it's not going to deliver the outcome what energy system needs to have.
Absolutely, Manu. I'm going to take just go down that rabbit hole a little bit. You touched on it, which is the digital backbone or the digital spine. Yeah, it's certainly a word that we've used an awful lot in our time together.
Yeah.
We describe, certainly within DCC, as our smart meters being described as that digital spine of the energy transition. And I really like that phrase because it suggests something that's really structural.
Yeah.
It's at the heart of our energy system. This is the backbone, 30 million connected homes.
Yes.
I guess for you, when did that framing really become real around the digital spine? Was there a moment when you stopped seeing smart meters as just devices in the home and started really seeing them as, yes, these are going to be part of critical national infrastructure?
Yeah, so I think in a layman's term, I think if you look at the human anatomy, right, we all can stand because our spine is strong enough, right? And if I look at it, and I know we had discussed this when you were part of DCC, is if you look at creating that energy system. I think it needs to be built on that exact anatomy of humans, right? In terms of what are the systems are needed to hold everything together, and what is the fundamental part which drives us to that transition. And for me, that's where I think I started thinking, okay, if you look at that, yes, it's a system you're creating on smart metering, but it is fundamental because without that, you cannot really converge into your demand generations, what's the utilization of it, how do you then transition to renewable, what infrastructure you build it. And I think I would say that's where I started thinking, yes, truly, I think that digital spine aspects really, it's not a pure technology term, but it allows to simplify to people who really wants to get involved in this, including the energy suppliers, retailers, DNOs, because they are in a shift of technology transformation, right? To achieve those net zero goals, they would have to implement these things. So it's like, how do you simplify that comm so everyone understand, how does that spine then connect everything across, whether it's assets, whether it's other areas of the system, whether it's in consumer home systems, because once you get that integrated, that's where really truly it holds together everything, like in a human anatomy of holding the spine and you being stronger in that sense. So I think that's where I think it really resonates really clearly in terms of simplification as well.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I in many ways see the evolving role of the NESO. That's really the brain of our energy system, the distribution network that it's really the veins and the arteries of the whole system. It's getting those electrons across to the endpoints. Smart meters got a key role to play in that.
Yeah.
Now, I know certainly from a UK perspective, we may have separated ourselves a little bit from Europe, but certainly the work you've been doing with ESMIG, the European Smart Metering Interest Group, I think is absolutely really, really important and really, really valued. It gets us outside of our silo, and certainly it was great to see the input that you had certainly when we were working together.
Yeah.
But I guess you're taking you from a very UK-focused environment to that much broader European conversation about smart metering, about data, about interoperability and market design. And so I guess let's reflect on why you thought it was important that we had that role certainly within DCC and in ESMIG, and what surprised you most about Europe, and what's changed some of your thinking around the smart energy infrastructure for the future?
Yeah, I think It's probably like having spent around, I would say, like, I started SMIG role around 3 years back, I think, when you were in DCC, and why I think it has like allowed me to think in terms of how I can contribute is more about broadening, as you rightly said, the perspective from what we have done in the UK program. And how does the European transformation story journey evolves, right? Because I think we have been leader in some areas of what we have done in UK, and it's about where the thinking is moving globally, and I think we start with Europe generally, right? And the key shift of thinking in terms of seeing smart meters as devices instead of recognizing them as part of broader spine system, but like having that as a fundamental, what we discussed earlier. Now, I think across the UK and Europe, essentially, it's about how do you build that foundation layer, which you touched basically on secure, interoperable infrastructure that enables the data, which is what I think NESO is doing right now in terms of the strategy of flowing reliably across the entire energy ecosystem. Now, I think this is where, because we are already ahead in terms of in UK in deployment of smart meters, I think it probably like worked well in terms of incorporating some of the learnings what we had from UK smart metering deployment and trying to impart that into the Europe. But also because Europe were in that transition phase, is what's that strategy in terms of decentralization, dynamic and data-driven traditional grid that Europe is thinking about? Because I think, yes, UK is not part of Europe, but I think there are policy and direction which do align sometimes. Now, from the standpoint of UK, if I look at it, organization like DCC, which operates smart meter, I think which operates these network, it's basically how Europe and UK can work together to I would say enable that platform for innovation. Because I think just deploying smart meters is the first step, but I think it's the flexibility in the market and how the consumer, the government policy. And ultimately, I know we will talk a little bit on AI driven, is how do you utilize that technology evolution to kind of then have that digital spine be robust, secure, and future ready? Because that's for me is like, the intersection of the foundation you start with, but then keep evolving. And what I've seen through SMIG is I don't see that the general consensus across industries that smart metering is not just a device, right? It's as we talked about, it's the digital spine for Europe energy. That phrase is also used in Europe a lot, right? So there is these alignments of infrastructure, enabling data, decentralization, and positioning, like, organization like DCC, like platform for innovation, and some of the networks aspects. And we have common challenge across Europe and UK. So for me, it was more around what we impart as from UK into the European energy transition, and how we can learn from the policy and directions on the European, because it has got number of states, right? So they have different challenges in terms of trying to meet every requirements of there. So I think it was a better interception of me to kind of contribute towards that. And one of the more interesting thing, which I will conclude, is around how I saw that collaboration coming together across that industry group, in terms of aligning the mandates, but also views from different countries across Europe on what their challenges are. So you can work openly on some of these challenges together as a consolidated approach. Something we have done in UK in terms of really one good thing is bringing all the systems together for retail energy suppliers instead of having an independent system. So I think for me it has been a learning, but it's also been a kind of imparting the knowledge we have gained through the deployment of smart meters in the UK.
Yeah, man, I think what you're saying really is thought leadership often requires thought sharing and collaboration.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of lessons to learn. UK, we didn't get everything right. We've certainly been on some painful parts of that journey. But I think, like you say, the UK is leading, certainly from a deployment and volume perspective. And some of our European partners are dealing with some other complex challenges, certainly around data.
Yes.
So I guess, that naturally leads me to, my next question, which is, when I look at some of the SMIG's manifesto, they've got really three important objectives, which is recognizing smart meters as critical infrastructure. There's that sensor network. This is really important, enabling data to benefit the market, data sharing, And then I guess ensuring or enabling fair competition. Fair is really interesting because a lot of lenses around fair. What's fair for the transmission network, maybe what's different and fair
Yeah.
for, I guess, the distribution network, and then what's fair for consumers. So easy to write that down on paper, but in practice, there can be real tension between all of those pillars, I guess,
Yeah.
competition versus coordination, market innovation versus system stability, which I spend a lot of my time around innovation at the moment. Any examples you can bring to life of where you've seen some of these tensions from a committee perspective in ESMIG, and how are they approaching some of those trade-offs?
Yeah, and a very good question, because I think we talked about like innovation, right? But then if you look at energy space, and I think security becomes fundamental, right, in terms of critical national infrastructure. And really, like, being nominated as an ESMIG executive member, we have like 5 people on the executive committee from different organizations. And there's a lot of discussions and tension, you're right, in 3 areas, right? I would say one is like openness. How much do we open? If you look at from the data perspective, right? Okay, then if that is something we achieve, like, how do you then drive security aspects? Because are you kind of undermining the security? Are you becoming too much kind of overlaying a heavy security wrapper, which then kind of doesn't allow us to kind of have open data, right? And then all the regional, national difference I talked about. So, right, like every country, even though Europe is one of X number of states, they have different needs, right? They have different challenges. And I think this is where I would say those were like, I would say three friction tension points in terms of evolving and making sure that whatever the smart metering ecosystem policies which Brussels built is fit for future. And aligning those shared principles across the different countries where one size fits all has been a challenge, right? And I have to, and I think how we have looked at this in terms of resolving those friction and challenges and bringing that, and you touched this, it is really a collaborative partnership approach where, yes, you have tension in discussion, but the whole objective and outcome is how can you make smart metering data accessible across Europe, right? That's the outcome, basically, right? Now, there are different ways of that. And like, to align that, it's about how do you then equip market participants around the Europe to enable that flexibility, security, and efficient energy markets, right? Because it's all about cost. Like, if you try to drive restrictions, then you're driving the consumer cost higher. So I think what we had discussed is really around the way a committee navigated through this is in terms of saying, okay, yes, it's a critical national infrastructure, but the data kind of sharing is fundamental. Yes, like, security needs to be looked at, and again, but that needs to be looked at so that it allows a fair competition across the energy market, but also on the people who are involved in building these systems. And I think we took individual use cases and build up certain principles on what the principles should be to achieve those outcomes and which are the must, right, in terms of adherence, so that we can then drive that into the policy aspects. So what those principles will allow is allow everyone in the state to follow those similar kind of guidelines so that they don't restrict the market aspects. And for me, I think the key insight, Mike, was program doesn't come from like choosing one objectives or one outcomes and other things. It's really by designing those infrastructure in such a way that it is fit and coexist for long term. And always, I think there'll be the tension within these 3 areas, which I think you're expert on that based on work you're doing, sharing data, security, and then how do you then make sure that that policy or your principles are future fit. So I think it's been, for us, I think the key takeaway is make sure your governed principles are robust enough to cater for that approach. And it is like, how do you then simplify that it's adoptable easily and it's realistic? So I think that's been the learning around that area. But yes, you're right. I think there has been tension in those 3 topics, definitely across lots of meetings.
Yeah, sure. I guess, Manu, from the outside, it's often overlooked, isn't it? We use the word utilities quite easily. We throw the term around. I was at the Future of Utilities this week, and there was a real energy in there. It was nice to see water and energy coming together. We won't go down the smart metering in water today, but it's certainly a space that's evolving rapidly in the UK. But utility seems like a simple word, but for me, it's utilities is you turn the tap on and water flows. You pull the plug out and the wastewater flows away,
Yeah.
or you flick the switch and the lights come on.
Yeah.
And boy, from an engineering perspective, I come from like you, man, I come from a telco background. When you talk about complex power system engineering, there's an awful lot goes into keeping the lights on, keeping the water flowing, and keeping the wastewater flowing away.
Yeah.
We take that from granted, I think, an awful lot, certainly from a consumer perspective. And that's why it's great that tension is there. And that's why it's a massive role. The policymakers and government have a role to do.
Yeah.
The regulator has a role to do in, I guess, keeping that tension there, but also unlocking and keeping the consumer at the heart of it. Yeah. But take a step back, obviously, we'll touch on the last one around Europe, which is around, what have you seen that UK's got right that Europe could learn from? Because I'm hoping we've got some European listeners on this.
Yeah.
And is there anything from a European perspective that we should be looking at from a different lens perspective?
Yeah,
and
boy, I did give a lot of thought of for this questions to get it right, and I think so that I think the listeners can get some really good insight. And I have that privileged position, I think, exactly as you talked about, seeing both sides of the world in the work which I think I'm doing in ASMIC, but also being involved for the last 10 years in UK smart metering. And I think what I would probably put into one key points for each areas, then going into multiple areas which we can talk about sometime later. I think I would say the contrasts are very clear, and again there are right ways, I think, or wrong ways we can always debate. One thing I would say UK got right was treating smart meters as a national infrastructure, because for me operating as a one for the whole market has its pros and cons, but I think we have seen that because of that, the centralized model UK adopted has driven some real efficiency, right, in terms of aligning all the usage of the smart metering network together. So you reduce duplication, you try to move towards the lowering the cost to operate at scale, which I think in the initial years is always difficult because you're trying to transform and implement that technology, right? So there will always be risk factor and you are trying to mitigate that. But once you start operating at scale within that model, you are much more can drive that cost efficiency through technology adoption to create that stable platform that evolves over time. So I think that's one thing I think UK has got right, I would say, and there is more work to be done in that area, as you have seen through the different work. I think the policymakers, the government, the retail and suppliers all are doing. I think where UK lacked and where I would say Europe is moving, and it could be because I think Europe started late in some of the countries, is more consistently kind of moving towards an infrastructure mindset, right? And trying to particularly focus smart metering ecosystems into long-term operational evolution, right? So it's not just you do once, it's about how do you try to drive this towards an alignment with the energy market changes that happens, right? And it's happening at a rapid pace. So that means basically I can use the term which is called future flexibility, right? So designing, and we talk about design for future, right, in our technology term. So this is more about designing for future flexibility in mind, because that's where they're looking at. And you have seen some of the work they're doing already on AI and data sovereignty on policies, which was released a few weeks back, and ASMIC had a role in that. How does the framework for competition comes through? How does the interoperability standards work through? Get that locked in, so it allows us to kind of look at the future, avoid lock-in on some of those things. Europe is already looking at, in terms of the supply chain, it's the geopolitical situation, and plan for the risk around that. And they're making policy where they're giving probably benefits to the technology partners in terms of cost, right? If they are building the products in Europe, for example, and not relying on Far East Asia every time. So I would say that's the key difference, is because these assets, Mike, as you know, will be on the wall for long number of years, right? And technology is evolved. So if you don't think about future flexibility, you are really creating some risk around those assets. So the balanced view I would say where every country should look at when they are moving into this transition journey is try to look at what is the right operating model for that ecosystem, but never forget that future flexibility should be fundamental as well when you're looking at designing systems like that in energy landscape. So it's more kind of like, options so they're tomorrow ready. And I think I would say that for me was the key difference I've seen in the last 3 years playing the role within the UK smart metering as well as in the Europe.
Yeah, like you say, man, it's a privilege, I guess, for you to get some of those insights. So that whole European journey, I've been on the sort of end of where France are. They mandated smart meter rollout, and they're getting some great data insights now because their smart meter rollout is complete. Germany is early on that journey. Some of the other countries that have smaller populations, you can get through your 7 to 10 million smart meter rollout quite quickly. They're now having to grapple with some of the challenges that we've seen, 2G, 3G switch off. As you touched on, a device that's on the wall for 15 years. We didn't have to think about post-quantum cryptography 10 years ago, did we? We now have to grapple with some of those. So as a technologist, it's a really interesting challenge to grapple with.
Yeah, and Finland, for example, take example of Finland, like Finnish Energy, right? So they came and presented at one of the SMIC meeting, and they're like mostly around 100% renewables if you look at that market. And what they've done is really created a data platform which is shared, which is open data, right? Which they've planned it when they started looking at. So they had that future flexibility in mind. Is if you want to move to renewable, the source of generation will have limitations, right, based on the weather conditions, X, Y, Z. Okay, how do you then use data? So they already have some of the aspects of data repository and all those areas well ahead of time. So I think these are the things where I would say UK and Europe needs to work together in the policy and learn from each other to say, okay, what fits national objectives and strategy clearly. So I think, it's not one size fits all. It's more about what works in different nations, but make sure future flexibility is fundamental on what we do today.
Yeah, I think that's why it's so important to share insights and to collaborate and address some of those challenges that every market's going to have, certainly on that net zero transition. I guess no podcast with technologists on is not going to use the word AI, I guess, at the moment. You went to Inlet last year, you came back from there, and I guess there was a lot of discussion around the role that AI is going to play. For me, AI is never about the hype cycle. It's not about bolting tools on. It's about using some of the capabilities in complex markets to fix some complex problems. And there's a real important shift around that. We talk about smart meters at their inception. They were a billing device. For me, they really are a sensor nowadays. They're a measurement device that sits in every home. What came out of Inlet back in Bilbao around, we really thought, I get it. I see where AI is going to be a major shift from an energy system perspective, not from the tools we bolt on in the enterprise, but really starting to unlock the value of both smart meters, but being a critical part of that backbone, the digital spine of our energy system.
Yeah, and yes, you're right. I think the way the technology is evolving, I think AI is fundamental on most of the things we do, right? Now, yes, there are like some areas where it will have a very, very big impact, and there are some areas where you would have to like do trial and error and then evolve, like usage of AI. And that's my view, personal view. At Enlit Europe, I was fascinated, and I think I did a small blog on that, as you rightly said, was the kind of moment really that crystallized the role AI can play in smart metering ecosystem or generally the energy market. And I had like few conversation with some of the companies who were doing like trials and proof of concepts around that area. And one conversation which struck me was the grid analytics demo by a company called Escremeno. If I get it right. And it was like a small demo, but it was an enterprise ecosystem demo, right? In terms of like how that will shape up. And that was using AI models basically and correlating the smart meter consumption data, which we all know is such fundamental. It's basically gold for everything we decide on the energy market. The network telemetry, right? So when you talk about the overall energy market, I think DNOs are already moving into a transition of connecting their assets and connecting their as many assets as possible in terms of getting that through currently telemetry, but in future they could probably use wireless, other communications in that, right? So to navigate through emerging issues. And I think for DNOs, the key part that this use case was addressing was how do they get effective looking at a proactive maintenance approach in terms of instability in the voltage or asset stress. because that is going to happen, right, in terms of like the infrastructure that is currently here. And that is mainly before that the faults are shown. Like, you know about power outage happens because of certain reasons, right? Surge in demand, surge in like, the transmission of power. And that analytics, what this company had built up, just shifted my mindset saying, okay, that's really a robust use case. Instead of using smart meter data just to do billing or like, look at consumptions of consumers, how can you use that to enhance your overall system for DNOs, right? So we talk about real-time consumptions for the future. This will allow that, right? In terms of, and if you look at AI, then if you move towards the AI as the edge of becoming an intelligence layer around that, that data can be analyzed without really delaying that transaction up to the ecosystem, right, and the core networks or wherever it is. So if you look at the telemetry data and what connected assets DNOs have, if you look at smart meter data, that really is a strong kind of use case of how you can use that data to have really a big impact in terms of maintenance, right? And also about getting some insight on better demand response. So what was impressed me, Mike, was we talk about this theoretically a lot, but to see a live demo use case, which basically based on consumption patterns that flags the network warnings and all these support in terms of real energy kind of analytics was a game changer for me. And I think that will evolve. And you talk about energy OS, right? So the more we move into the energy OS and then build that through the AI enhancements, it is a strong recipe to allow to reduce cost on the infrastructure, but also really bring that better data-driven insight into the system or overall energy system. So yeah, I think for me that was really struck me, and that's something will allow us to think different use cases driven by smart meter consumption data.
Yeah, man, you made me think about something just now as you've sort of been talking. I've certainly been the connectivity evangelist around connectivity. I guess accelerates innovation and really enables innovation. We use the term AI an awful lot as around a series of tools, but maybe we should rephrase and reterm AI as accelerating innovation, not artificial intelligence.
I think that's immediate kind of thinking where your brain starts working on that. I think that's a good shout. That's a good shout because it just expedites the things which we want to do, right? If it used rightly and if the use cases are well defined.
Well, things that used to take us months to do, we can do in weeks, if not in days now. I've heard some stories over the weekend of people coding new platforms within 24 hours from an idea to releasing a production capability, and that's what it unlocks.
Exactly, Mike, yeah.
Well, we spent a good bit of time around talking about smart metering, but let's break out of that now. I think it's important. I've been sort of great to see some of your journey, certainly around the role you're now moving to sort of that sort of angel investor. You've spent certainly 3 decades, within enterprises building products, platforms, and infrastructure. You're sharing some of the insights from your time in Qualcomm around NFC, and through smart metering. I guess that really you had the privilege to get many different lenses. So you're now starting to look at early stage sort of tech businesses. When a founder sits opposite you and pitches an idea, what do you see from a tech perspective that some of those investors might be missing? That unique lens that you've got. The honesty you can bring, the blind spots that they may not be thinking about when that's sat in front of you.
Yeah, and I think, boy, I did think a lot about this last year when I started looking into this area, and I said, okay, having spent like 3 decades in technology and in different projects, and I think I'm very proud of what I have achieved over a number of years, is how do I impart what I've learned into organizations who are trying to seek help, not just I think in terms of technology, but also in the areas of where they can have a biggest impact. Like, we talked about societal impact, we talk about national impact, right? So I started like looking into where should I start, and I think I started like looking more into like more angel investing areas because and I got him in touch with one organization called Angel Academy, which really supports female founders of startups, and I went to some of their sessions and everything. And what I was impressed on this was the enthusiasm by these women founders, and they were in clean tech, they were in health tech. They were in pure technology, they were in cybersecurity. So what drove me into this area was really when I look at the investment as a pure like my journey, which is like I'm no expert, Mike, because I've just invested in one company. I thought what I need to look at is where I can like really challenge them to achieve the outcome they want, or to have like the business impact they would like, right? Because it's not about generating revenue. I think revenue generation happens as an entrepreneur if you're kind of really trying to put your ideas into the right areas, but also where you can have a biggest impact across nations, across geography and everything. So what I looked clearly on organization was the national scale impact of their ideas, and whether it's a platform, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's cybersecurity, clean tech. I think that for me was the key. And I came up with one organization who are playing a space in cybersecurity, basically, right? And now if I look at that, and we talked about quantum, right? If you move forward looking, the quantum will change how we perceive security, right? I think, yes, we'll always look at like, lack of tools and XYZ, creating that security vulnerability. But for me, I think having kind of a solution or a design of certain products and services, looking at what the real operational environment aspects needs to be considered to then kind of drive that high security adherence or quantum resistance algorithms, if you look at it. I think that's what drove me to these organizations, because what they were looking at is really a mathematical statistical model in terms of identity and access, two areas, right? Which we know are fundamental in terms of when you get hacking from different state actors and everything. So for me, I think if you to your answer to your questions in a simplistic way, I think more my kind of as an end investor, what I look at is the overall operational real-time impact of their business solutions which they're proposing. How can then they scale without driving that cost? Because I think as an investor, I also would like to have some profit, right? But more around how they can then have their thinking of innovations around scaling without really driving that operational cost up, right? So this is where the technology interception comes in. Are they choosing the right technology? Are they having right people? Are they using the capability across their customer base rightly, or understanding the customer problems, and either testing their systems under stress, for example, right? So for me, at the those were the areas I was looking at as an end investor, and then how do I find their blind spots where I can then impart my knowledge based on what I've learned. And I think this is where I would say people who are looking at angel investing, it's about looking at where you can add value to the business. Don't look at it's just I'm investing and I'll get a return of investment, but more around be like a silent investor, fine. But I think also look at, for like if you're definitely a technologist, look at how you can use your capability and skill sets to enhance their business and get the outcome which you want. And then you will always have finance generations and everything, because for me that's my fundamental, and I think I don't want to become a silent investor. I think I'm looking at angel investing as a means of being a technology advisory for those organizations to drive their costs lower, but then scale their business. And I think for me, that's the fundamental. From my view of angel investing, I think everyone has a different perceptions of how they look at angel investing. Some people look at just from the financial aspects. So yeah, it's been still a start of a journey. I've invested in one company. I can share offline on which that is later to you, but yeah, it's been still, and I get to see that every 3 months you get a report from their board and CEO in terms of where they are and everything. Is really fascinating to read that, and it also increases your knowledge.
Yeah, man, I love the honesty, and as a technologist, as we both are, it's great to see you calling out that technology should not be the reason for any change. Really understand the why you're doing it. What's the problem statement? What's the outcome you want to achieve? Yeah. And where can technology maybe be the accelerator or the enabler? Exactly. But really understand what that problem statement and the outcome is first. Yeah. And sometimes, just as technologists, sometimes it's difficult to step back from that. But it sounds like you really are stepping back from that, but using that as one of those inflection points as you go on that journey.
Yeah, definitely, yeah, and it's still learning.
Manu, we've certainly talked about this over the last 5 years, and as you did your sort of CTO MBA that you're on, Some of the insights you were getting from a wider community outside of DCC was really valued you sharing those with me. But I guess the role of technology rather than is no longer a set of tools. I guess every organisation has an operating system that's now never more so is going to be enabled by the technology systems that are coming along. What is the role of AI? You can't bolt AI on. You have to bring it back into being part of the energy, heart of your organisation. We spent a lot of time talking about within our previous slides about being future ready and future fit. So doing the exercise you need now to be ready for the future. Now, I guess as you look at that sort of playbook, the role of the technologist and organisation, it really has changed. It's no longer sitting on the outside; it needs to be at the heart of it. I'm certainly seeing a greater role that technologists have to play at the board level. And that comes with accountability and responsibility. Shifting boards from that sort of governance model to really giving, supercharging the organisation.
Yeah.
So what do you think technology leaders really need to unlearn? We've got to stop doing some things. And what do we need to be ready for in that sort of, in the future fit, future ready organisation? What do we need to do differently and how do we stay future ready?
Yeah. And I have been doing a lot of thinking on it. I know, like, we talked about this when you were in DCC a lot, in terms of what the future CTO role should be, right? Or a chief architect role or technology director role should be. And one theme, I think, which I'm slowly recognizing, and as part of, a technology leader is, I think the previous insight where we have been brought in, we need to unlearn that. I think that's not going to be what it will be the future for technologists. And the view currently is that, CTO is like a primary expert or a decision maker. I think that's not going to hold true in my view, right? In future, that's my view, personal view, because in pre-AI era, if you see, and we bring AI into the equation because that will transform. And I've been doing some readings around. I don't know if you have heard of a book from Jeff Woods in terms of how do you become an AI driven leader. Really good book to read through if anyone is interested in, but also some of the learnings I've done through my MBA academy, and three things which pre AI era which I see has as a technologist always being looked at is having the deepest technical knowledge, designing the right architecture and making critical calls, right? But in AI-driven world, that mindset becomes a constraint, in my view, right? So we have to change that mindset, and this is where it comes through that AI. How do you become an AI-driven leader? Because a CTO who remains the smartest person in the room, I would say, will be a bottleneck. I think what you should be looking at as a CTO, which is basically looking at in terms of future ready, is how quickly you can get your organization to learn, first thing, right? The second is how do you confidently act under uncertainty using the AI tools or AI initiatives you have, because I think it will really give you a better informed decision making, but with a lot of data driven insight, which we all know if used rightly. And then how do you enable and drive your organization to become resilient to change? And again, these things, for example, you take example of AI adoption, right? The first mindset as a technologist or teams, your team will say, my job is at risk. And that cultural shift on people for me is the role of CTO, by saying, I think it's not about your job is at risk as an example. It's more about how you can use AI to make you better, or become a better thought leader. And I know we have had few discussions around this, is use that as an enabler to enhance you in your technology role, right? And for me, that people cultural shift is a role of technology. It's not role of HR, or it's not role of other functions, because that for me is where the future CTO will kind of drive that change. The other part I would say is, let's, as a technologist leader, let's use AI to learn and evolve, how we can make and enable decision making across the organization, including board, including executives we work with, and help them. And how do we drive resiliency across the organization? And I think it's not, for me, it's not going to be just knowing the things, of technically. It's about how do you look at the business wide impact. And I think that that shift will happen, Mike, because I still believe, like, I don't know if that role will called as a chief technologist officer or chief AI officer, whatever it is. But it's less about what technology know-how than I think being a leader and trying to drive that business transformation in the AI era. And I think for me that will be definitely something I want to see in the next 4 5 years, and that will happen.
Yeah, mate, for me, you've just touched on, which is keeping the human in the loop, which is really, really important.
Yeah,
You'll have to share your reading list recommendation. I always love getting a reading recommendation.
yeah.
I'm certainly got two interesting ones at the moment. I don't always like the titles of them, but I've certainly been reading it. Very AI centric. But if anyone builds it, everyone dies.
Yeah.
Some interesting views in there. That's a really, really good read. Food for thought. And my current one, which is again, I don't necessarily like the title, but We Are as Gods by Peter Diamandis, which is a great book around will AI deliver abundance? Really thought provoking. So maybe the titles could have done with a bit of rethinking, but they're certainly strong insights into the future ahead of us. Manu, you certainly touches the role of the technologies is evolving quickly. We almost feel like we need to be strategists sometimes as well.
Yeah.
Difficult in organisations, we've talked a lot is how do you get that better interlock? Certainly a C-suite, the role of the CTO, the role of the CISO, the role of the COO, they used to be their own little silos. We need to break those silos down and get real interlock as leaders in organisations, but keeping our people in the loop of all of that as technologists,
Yeah,
really, really important.
and you're right, because that's why I touched base on, like, it's not about being the expert. It's about, we call it as intelligent orchestration, how technologies become an intelligent orchestrator to frame right questions, to challenge assumptions, ensure insight flows, but also the decision enablement. When you look at it, like, how does that technology use data to enable decision making? And I think the key thing for us as a technologist is not to really create a kind of robust guardrails, because in AI era, what I see, I think generally in organization, and I've been talking to a lot of my friends who have their business as well in technology, is how do you balance that guardrails and adoption of AI, because too many control points will block organization to shift into the AI era, right? So it's more about deciding, like, what kind of level, and this is where, like, I think the Jeff Woods book talks about that leadership lens on leaders' job is not to control or constrain. It's about how do you fit your organization in that technology evolution era to deliver or empower and enable that innovation happening. Because I think, as you have seen, like, all the good things happen when you open up at a certain level. Yes, you should have a framework, but it's more about how much balanced framework you can kind of have in your organization to enable that transition. And for me, that is, like, the role of technologists now. It's not role of CISO, or it's not role of, like, I would say CEO or other executives. So I think that will shift, that will change.
Yeah, man. I use the word breakwater leadership. We need to be breakwaters as leaders to create that calm harbour where people can get on with all the challenges they've got in any organisation now. So that's really, really important. Conscious of time, we're nearly run out. We're going to have one closing question, which is going to be a real challenge for you. But I know you're up for it because you have a privilege. And as a technologist, I know you're already thinking about 2045 and 2050 within DCC and what that needs to look like. Not many technologists nowadays can think about 2045 and 2050. In fact, it's hard enough thinking about next year and what the models are going to mean. Where's Anthropic? Where's OpenAI? Where's SpaceX? Are we putting data centers in space? So let's do a full circle. We opened up with where you were when you started your career. So if you're going to advise somebody coming into the tech industry, the tech sector, where should they be building their career now? How are they going to make a real impact? What would you tell them and why about the next 5 to 10 years ahead for them? Where the opportunities are? What are you seeing as a technologist?
Oh, let me think. I think this is a matter of next 30 years or 20 years, right?
Yep.
I think if I look at it, and I started this, right, as an individual or as an engineer or graduate or any other streams they do, I think always think about what's your strongest ethics and capabilities for me, right? And if I look at, like, I started my journey in India, but this is global now, right? You can work anywhere in India. I think I would say three things are converging, right? And you touch this a lot in your blogs, in your talks, which you do. And digital infrastructure is not about like connecting things and everything. The three fundamental shift that will happen, and we have touched base in today's podcast really on most of the topics. Energy, connectivity, data, and AI, right? If I look at like four things basically, right? If you look at that. And these are long-term relevance because I don't think they will go away, right? These are going to last. And if I look at 30, 40 years, but how these are utilized in collective one approach is going to be fundamental. And it will be of national importance for every nation across the world. It's not just UK specific. It's not Euro specific. It's not India specific. It's not North America and Asia and everything. So there is a long-term relevance of this, right? And of national importance, and looking at how the world landscape is changing in terms of geopolitical, the energy reliance, prices and everything. So there is a big problem for every nation to solve in this space, right? And it's not done by just moving to a smart meter. There's a lot more to be done. And we talked about people look for career resilience in future, right? So if I started my journey like in 2001 in India, I'll always look, oh, can I work 30 years or 40 years, right? Before I retire or whatever I do. And I don't like the word retirement, but that's something people think. So I would say that for me is fundamental, is choose areas where you know your capabilities are strongest, where you think you have passion, and then look at what will have a nation and societal impact in terms of, and then I think why I will say that is it's similar to my journey in 1990 when I started. I didn't look at I need a title or I need to work on this technology or this XYZ. I started with the foundation aspects of where I think that passionate me, right, on RF and other things. And then I evolved. As I learned, I evolved towards different roles, different transformation projects and everything. So for me, over the time, there are three things, Mike, which I will say to individuals listening to this podcast and graduate engineers or people who wants to really look at where should I kind of build my career on. Over time, I feel telecom will become a digital infrastructure. Infrastructure will become data-driven, right? Because we talked about data, that will be really fundamental, and we have so much insight on data. AI is built because the data conversion, collaboration and machine learnings and all those stuff that has happened, right? It's not just built off nowhere. It has been a journey. And then I think how then you use that data to become an intelligent individual contributing to the business impact of nation or organization is really great. So I think those three things for me are fundamental to people to start thinking when they're selecting the right choice of career. It could be you can still become a maths expert and still contribute to this. You can become a computer scientist, you can still contribute to this. You can become a regulatory or policy aspects of things. But really look at what's the relevance for the next 20, 30 years, where the insight, and there's a lot of information available for audience around, like, you know, people like you who do all the blogs, and there are a lot of information available also on the internet, or use AI. So I think that's what I would say to people listening to this podcast, linking that with my journey.
Yeah, I'm going to play that back, and what I hear is, I think in many ways engineers operate in silos. The future engineers must be silo breakers. AI won't replace the value and power of human connection.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Engineers are the silo breakers.
Yeah, and don't think like technology evolution as a kind of thing where you think, oh, like, you know, will I be relevant? No, I think embrace that and try to use it, how you can utilize that to improve yourself, because it's always, change happens for reasons, but it's all how you adopt that. So I think that's what I would really tell individuals.
Yeah, in many ways, technology is future fit, future ready to make the world a better place.
Exactly. Well said.
Thanks, man. Great place to close. Thanks so much for the time today and sharing some of those insights.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, and have a good weekend. Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.